Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the events that lead to one of the most contentious elections in American history, and that is the election of 1800. And we really want to look at some of the conflicts that are going to arise not only from this election, but basically what's the beginnings of our second party system. So just to give you a little background, our first president, George Washington, was unanimously elected twice, but the people to follow him are going to be more closely tied to political party and a political agenda, and an interpretation of the Constitution, which is going to begin to divide our country into factions, the one thing that George Washington warned against. But you can see here that in 1796, we have a pretty close contest, and that contest ended up being in the favor of John Adams. So he becomes our second president. Back before the 12th Amendment, second place, the runner-up, became the vice president. So Jefferson, being of a different political bent, becomes the vice president to John Adams. In 1800, we have an election again, and this time you can see a little bit of shifting. What were the people who had been in power? The Federalists are not going to have quite the control they do by 1800. And that electoral map belies one important factor, which is that it wasn't simply two candidates, but ultimately four candidates, two from each party. And we will have a highly contentious election. So with the election of 1800, we have truly two different political parties. We have the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. And they had lots of issues to debate. Although back then presidents did not meet face-to-face to debate, they wrote letters sometimes, the opinion editorials that were published in newspapers, or people represented them and spoke out at assemblies and other kinds of rallies. But the way you ran for president in 1800 was quite a bit different than how you do today. But they had lots of things to discuss, things like the Alien and Sedition Acts. Were we going to continue to side, it seemed, politically or trade-wise with the British? What were we going to do with the French? And ultimately, Jefferson will win because the Federalist Party is basically divided on who wants to support President Adams. And the father of the party, Alexander Hamilton, by 1800 doesn't like Adams at all and actually believes that it might be better off that he isn't the winner. And ultimately, what Hamilton does in order to make the election go for Thomas Jefferson will ultimately cause him to face his death against one of the other people running for election in 1800, and Aaron Burr. There are also going to be some things that help Jefferson, part of that being the Three-Fifths Compromise. So in the last map, you saw a lot of the southern states voting for the Democratic Republican Party, and certainly you had white voters who were voting Democratic Republican. But again, if you remember the Three-Fifths Compromise, you know that those large populations of enslaved Africans and African Americans are going to be part of the reason why there's a lot more electoral power in these southern states at that time than just simply that which comes from the white populace. So it's such a contentious election. We have four nominees, two from the Democratic Republicans, two from the Federalists, and there's no clear electoral winner. Of the four, nobody has a clear margin. And the Constitution says there's a plan B if that should happen. It should go into the House of Representatives, and they will decide. They have to vote almost 37 times in order to come up with Jefferson as the winner. And some of that happens last minute, in Hamilton saying he doesn't like to see somebody like Adams become president again. He doesn't like one of the other four nominees, who was an old friend of his, Aaron Burr, who he had soured on. And so he felt that his political enemy was still the better candidate. And in the end, that's how Jefferson wins. Jefferson always called it the Revolution of 1800 when he wrote about it later in his life. And he meant it as revolutionary in that you had a changing of power between two different political parties, and there wasn't bloodshed. This was a highly contentious election, but the result that the House of Representatives turned over was the one that people could live with. So some words from Jefferson. He said, the true principles of the Revolution of 1800, for that was as real as the revolution in the principles of our government, as that of 1776 was in its form, not affected indeed by the sword as that, but by the rational and peaceable instrument of reform, the suffrage of the people. The nation declared its will by dismissing the functionaries of one principle and electing those of another in the two branches, executive and legislative, submitted to their election. So the country not only decided that they were going to change party, but they did so also in the legislative branch as well. So the Federalists are losing quite a bit of power, most of that to be blamed on those Alien and Sedition Acts. But there'll be other implications that come from Jefferson winning. Even today, when whoever wins the election for president, often there's a discussion about how that party is going to influence things like the Supreme Court. And that was no different in the early 1800s. So Congress back in 1789 went and passed a law called the Judiciary Act. And the idea was that it was going to set up a federal court system. And that was fine until it became an issue of, well, how are all of these people going to work within the confines of Article 3 of the Constitution? There were only 4 members of the Supreme Court back then, and with the Judiciary Act, Congress ultimately was creating judgeships and then allowing whoever was the president to fill those positions. And on the eve of Jefferson being inaugurated in 1801, Adams appointed a bunch of people, but they didn't actually go through Congress's approval. And this will become the very first time that the Supreme Court will exercise what becomes their bread and butter, what they do most often, which is this idea of judicial review. So in 1801, there is a judge, Mr. John Marbury, who was one of these midnight judges. He had been appointed by Adams, but he never officially got his appointment. And the reason he didn't is because James Madison, who was the Secretary of State to Thomas Jefferson, never delivered the letter. Marbury believed he was entitled to this. He was a good Federalist. And he went to his friends at the Supreme Court and said, what should I do? And the advice that he was given was to raise the issue that this was one that was about the Constitution and that the Supreme Court would need to intervene. And so they did. And in 1803, the 4 justices made a decision. And they said that Mr. Marbury didn't really deserve his job because the way he was going to get that appointment was by an unconstitutional law, the Judiciary Act of 1789. But John Marshall went a little further to say that the Jefferson White House had done something wrong, that the business of the national government doesn't simply stop in the executive branch when you switch presidents, that the executive branch and its work continues on. So what is orchestrated by one administration needs to be honored by the next one that follows. So really neither side wins. Marbury doesn't get his appointment to be a federal judge. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson get told, you know better, you shouldn't have done this in the first place. The person who wins from this is John Marshall, because now the Supreme Court has a task before them that isn't part of what is their domain as a part of the 3rd article of the Constitution. They now have this power of judicial review. And John Marshall was right. He said the particular phraseology of the Constitution of the United States confirms and strengthens the principle supposed to be essential to all written constitutions, that a law repugnant to the Constitution is void, and that courts, as well as other departments, are bound by that instrument. Ultimately saying that whenever you have a law that's unconstitutional or an executive order that's unconstitutional, it's the Supreme Court that probably should be making those decisions. We shouldn't be relying on compact theory and states' rights, as Thomas Jefferson asserted, but that the Supreme Court might be the best arbiter of what is constitutional and what isn't. But the Federalists now are in decline. Not only have they lost this election of 1800 and lost the presidency, but they also will be replaced in Congress by many Democratic Republicans. To go even further, by 1804, what had been a 20-year saga between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr resulted in Aaron Burr challenging Hamilton to a duel, which was illegal at the time, but still something that men often engaged in. And Aaron Burr, while the sitting vice president of the United States, because he ends up getting second in that election of 1800, shoots Hamilton. And that really kind of ends the Federalist Party in the sense that they don't really have an intellectual father anymore. That was really the role that Hamilton had fulfilled for a very long time. By the 1830s, the only person who probably still truly is a Federalist is the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall. He was appointed in the 1790s, and for almost 40 years, he is a Federalist in the way that he chooses to interpret the Constitution most of the time. He's going to have many opportunities to extend federal power. But within the other two branches, the Federalists no longer have the power they once did. But you can see from our electoral maps here that steadily, 1804, 1808, 1812, you see a lot of representation for the Democratic Republicans. At times it'll wane, but you still see that electorally in these presidential elections, they have a lot of power. Jefferson as president is going to be a little different as Jefferson in the party out of power. He is going to have a vision, however, for the United States that is as instrumental as Alexander Hamilton's was. If Hamilton as the Federalist was interested in commerce and banking, Jefferson's vision was about land, what he called the yeoman farmer, an agrarian republic. He saw this country being one of self-reliant farmers and everybody having land ownership, and that was going to be a key element of equality and democracy. Westward expansion, right? He's the father of the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So he, long before he becomes president, has this westward expansionist vision. He also wants to encourage popular voting, and that was one of the points of the Democratic Republicans, that they were constantly trying to deal with the issue that when the Constitution was written, the state constitutions were written back in the 1770s, 1780s, so many of them put land and property tax restrictions on voting. You had to own land or pay taxes in excess of some value, which meant that plenty of white males couldn't vote. However, throughout the early 1800s, you're going to see the Democratic Republican Party, especially at the state level, encouraging popular sovereignty. And so eventually you will get universal white male suffrage. But one of the first architects of that is Thomas Jefferson. He also wants to kind of undermine and get rid of some of the taxation that Hamilton felt was crucial to the running of the government. The excise tax, so that whiskey tax is going to go away. Tariffs are going to be lowered as well. There was a lot of controversy that tariffs really only helped those who were involved in the merchant economy, those who were involved in manufacturing and industry. It protected them from having to compete with the global economy. But farmers, they didn't have the benefit of that. And so Hamilton's vision was something that Jefferson was kind of working against as president. He will, as president, greatly expand the United States. So he is the chief architect of what will become the Louisiana Purchase. Emperor Napoleon of France is going to write to Jefferson and offer him that very large portion of land that was about the size of what was already the United States that was existent at that time. He's going to be able to purchase it for a bargain price of $10 million. And he's going to agree to this as the executive, although he actually didn't have the power to do this. He's going to have to go back to Congress because they're the ones that are going to actually have to write the check. But Jefferson, often railed against executive authority when he was not the executive himself, but as president, he is going to use that executive power in all kinds of interesting ways. So not only does he negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, but he also goes on to create something called the Corps of Discovery. Two gentlemen, one that he knew very well, Meriwether Lewis, who had been his private secretary, and General William Clark. They were hired to go and explore and map what will be the upper Mississippi River, the Missouri River, and then traveling westward until they could get to the Pacific Ocean. That is well outside of the Louisiana Purchase itself. But it was important to Jefferson that if the U.S. was going to be making further claims westward, we needed to map that land as soon as possible. That Corps of Discovery included 27 other people, including a man named York, who was William Clark's slave. Also Sacagawea, who was a young woman who was an Indian guide, who they found and paid to come with them once they had reached what would be modern-day Montana. She helped them reach the Pacific and then get back. But the Corps of Discovery, over the course of 2 years, will end up being able to claim not only much of this land that is west of the Louisiana Purchase, simply because they had already mapped it. And we will continue to work with Britain and Spain for the next 40 years to finally get true claim to the land, particularly that in the Pacific Northwest. Jefferson's a very challenging person to deal with historically, in part because for someone who often advocated for abolition in the future, he was a slave owner. Upon his death, he had more than 300 slaves, all but those who were related directly to him. So we believe that he had at least 4 children with an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings. She and her 4 children were freed. No other slave upon his death was. He was someone who said that the country ultimately would be divided by slavery and perhaps even fight over slavery if it didn't end, but within his own lifetime couldn't do that personally. He also is the person who will, with this land ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, abolish slavery from existing north of the Ohio River. So he is on both sides of the fence, politically talking about how slavery is going to be ruinous to the country, but personally not being able to economically or socially distance himself from the institution. In 1800, the same year of this contentious election, there was a slave conspiracy, what is known as Gabriel Prosser's Rebellion. We called it conspiracy because there were caches of weapons found, but for many of the people who were arrested in its aftermath, including the person who supposedly read it, Gabriel Prosser, he never admitted to actually running a rebellion. But he lived outside of what is Richmond today. He was a very highly skilled blacksmith. He was somebody who actually knew how to make the weapons of the day. And there was a belief that there was a slave rebellion. Gabriel Prosser never admitted to it, but there were others who said when they were caught with weapons that he was the architect of this potential rebellion. But that is going to be chilling to whites who own slaves in the American South. And so at a time where you have people like Jefferson saying slavery shouldn't be going into this Northwest Territory and that we should do something about ending slavery, we're no longer importing enslaved peoples after 1808. We are going to see essentially a second Middle Passage develop. The large numbers of enslaved people, particularly in places like Maryland and Virginia, they and the children they will go on to have will be sold further south. By the 1790s, we have the invention of the cotton gin, and cotton is going to become the most important cash crop in the world, and it grows no better place, at least at that time, than in the American South. So people talk about there was essentially a second Middle Passage, an internal slave trade and movement from the early 1800s all the way to the eve of the Civil War. So at a time where we're talking about extending freedom, for some, we are seeing ourselves becoming further mired in the issue of slavery in the American South. Foreign policy-wise, this is going to be an area of both strength and weakness for Jefferson. So we had talked in an earlier video about these Barbary pirates, this group of mercenaries and pirates who live in the Mediterranean and control trade there. Most of the European nations, including Britain and France, they pay off the pirates not to attack their ships. The U.S. didn't have money. Once it did, it still won't pay off the pirates. And there were so many captures of U.S. vessels by 1801 that Jefferson decided to take this navy that he railed against, that Adams had used in the late 1790s, for the purposes of getting rid of the Barbary pirates. And they do. And that is certainly a highlight in terms of foreign policy. But then there's going to be other issues in this time period. You're still going to have British impressment of American sailors. There will be a U.S. naval ship, the Chesapeake, which will actually be fired upon and sunk, killing many of the members of its crew by a British man of war. So you have this navy that's going to be put to good use, but it's also going to be one that's still vulnerable to the much larger British Navy because of attacks on American ships, particularly by the British, but there's going to still be some by the French occasionally. There was a decision made that there should be an embargo, that the U.S. would be better off if it just blocked trade from both Britain and France. This obviously is not just an executive decision. It's an act, it's a law, so it was proposed and went through Congress. But again, Congress is also Democratic, Republican, is also not looking towards international trade, but looking internally with our own economy. Did not realize, though, that the Embargo Act would horribly affect the American economy. The U.S., yes, may not need to buy as much manufactured goods from France and England as it once did, but it still produces large amounts of cash crops and staple crops that are grown exclusively for an export market. From 1807 to 1809, they are not able to sell that abroad, and that will greatly negatively affect farmers. A little piece of artwork from the time, making fun of two things, really. So the first one is that with the Alien and Sedition Acts, both of which get repealed during Jefferson's administration, you do see people from time to time going back to this idea that you can't speak out directly against the president or the Congress. And so we have a big turtle here who's latched on to this man holding this barrel of probably super fine sugar or some high quality good. And the other gentleman is saying, damn it, how it nicks him. And the man who's now being attacked by the giant turtle or tortoise says, oh, this cursed oh grab me. Oh grab me is embargo backwards. So just a kind of a play on words, but also making fun of the fact that at one time, a short period of time, you couldn't directly censure the executive branch or the Congress. Jefferson's impact is going to be one just like Hamilton's, that it will be long-lasting. The United States and its desire for westward expansion is going to so define the 19th and even much of the 20th century. That is Jefferson's vision. There is enough land. Everybody can have land. If you can own land, then you'll have a greater sense of equality. You'll be self-sufficient. That fosters democracy. Just as important as the ideas that Hamilton was looking at in terms of banking and international trade and having a strong federal government. But some of the things that Jefferson will do, including this desire for greater westward expansion and being willing to use the U.S. Navy to go up against some of its enemies, will ultimately lead us to what will become the War of 1812. The British have not fully left the North American continent on the eve of the War of 1812. The Atlantic Ocean, there's still a lot of contestation developing in that part of the world as well. So Jefferson's impact is going to be one that certainly many people will benefit from over the course of the next 2 centuries. But as we will see in our next lesson, it will also lead us to the first declared war in American history. So to end today, we want to be thinking about the political parties of our first party system. So the policies, how did the Democratic Republicans, those presidents and those Congresses differ from the Federalists? And why did they differ? Also, why did the Federalists fall out of favor? That certainly will begin to happen with that election of 1800, but by 1815, they will no longer exist. So as we get through our 3.8 lesson, that's one of the things we want to consider is how do you have the first political party in American history have only a 20-year shelf life? Decide what is it about their value system that was useful, but eventually was no longer deemed necessary or valuable by the American people.